Hello, and thanks for joining us today in this seventh episode of the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. We're so glad that you're here today, and I'm thankful that you're going through this with us each day, reading from God's Word. This week, we are in Genesis chapters 19, 20, and 21, Psalm chapter 7, and Matthew chapter 7, which is the very end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So I'm glad that you're going to be a part of this. We want to get right to it today. We want to start talking about God's Word and all the things that you're going to be experiencing this week as you join us in the Well Bible Reading Journey as we go through it together. So thanks for being here. I'm going to ask Craig and Amber to join me again. Craig and Amber, thanks for being here. It's good to see you guys.
Hey.
So yeah, we have a lot to talk about today. So many things in these chapters, especially Genesis. We have the tail end of the completion of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which really started last week in Genesis chapter 18. So we might talk a little bit about that as well, chapter 18 and 19 of Genesis. Why don't we start there? Amber, what did you get this week from this amazing story, Sodom and Gomorrah?
Yes, Ellis, thank you. So I saw these really neat parallels between Genesis 18 and Genesis 19 that I just want to throw out and help us see these things. But first, let's just do a little backstory just so we can get the whole picture. Chapter 18, which we read last week, was the story of Abraham, and he's still hanging out under those oak trees of Mamre near Hebron. He's still there. He's basically, that tells us he's still in the promised land that God promised him. Him and his family and his flocks are all still in the promised land. And then you have chapter 19 where you have Lot, and he is in Sodom. And you have Abraham getting visited by God in the form of three men, and Lot being visited by two of those three men at the beginning of 19. Yeah. And there's some really neat parallels here that I wanted to point out. So first, you have Lot sitting at the gate of the city, and you have Abraham sitting at the door of his tent.
Yes.
And then right after that, you have Lot saw and rose up and went out to greet the two men he saw. And then you have Abraham who looked up, saw, and ran out to greet the three men he saw. Yeah. And then you have Lot, he bowed to the ground. And you have Abraham, he bowed to the ground.
Right.
And then Lot addresses the men. Lot addresses the men, my lords, lowercase, plural. Right. And you have Abraham addressing the men and says, my Lord, capital and singular. And then you have Lot, the story of him washing his feet and having a meal and providing for them, having a meal with them. And you have Abraham and Sarah doing the same thing. They wash the feet, they have a meal. So those are the two parallels of the two stories, which is really, really neat to see those side by side. Ellis, if you don't mind, I have three things I want to point out about those things. Awesome. Great. Thank you. The first one is in chapter 18, when you have this kind of frantic story of Abraham saying, hey, Sarah, quick, get some flour, make some cakes. You know, it seems like this really interesting detail because and Lot also feeds them. It's very custom. Ellis, you mentioned this last week, very custom for them to be very hospitable, to take them in, to wash their feet, to bring them into their home, feed them, provide for them. And this is exactly what Lot is doing as we read this week. But last week we see them going over beyond with this language of flour, fine flour, and cakes, and this calf, all these things. And the reason why this is brought up is because it is exactly the same language that you will see in Leviticus 2 when it comes to the thanks offering. So the author wants us to notice that Abraham knows exactly who he's dealing with immediately. It is the Lord, it is God. And so him and Sarah are kind of represented as priests, and they're making a thanks offering and dining with God, which is really, really neat. That's the first thing. Good. Secondly, I want you to notice the progression of Lot's life. You have first Lot looking towards Sodom in chapter 13, and then you have him pitching his tent towards Sodom in chapter 13, verse 12. Then you have him living in Sodom, starting in chapter 14. And now you see here, he's a civic leader of the city. When you see someone sitting at the gate, that is actually kind of like their town hall. And he's basically providing his civic leadership duty. So now he's a leader doing this. And also you see him lose everything in Sodom. That's the second thing I want you to notice. The third thing is that unlike Abraham, who immediately recognized God's presence and calls him Lord, capital L, Lord, even though there's three of them, he calls him Lord. you have Lot, who doesn't recognize the men as angels or as Lord right away, or maybe not even at all. You see him over and over again actually say lowercase lords. And I think that he's maybe thinking that these are distinguished guests, maybe even with an air of righteousness and morality. That's why he bows to them, because he's fulfilling his duty as a civic leader in the town, not because he thinks that they're special or angels or the Lord. So those are some of the things I noticed right off the bat. I'll just shoot it back to y'all. Talk about it.
No, that's great. I think there's definitely this compare contrast that's going on from the beginning when Abraham and Lot come into the land. And so you have this compare contrast as you notice with Abraham and Lot. And in many respects, it seems like Lot has learned from his uncle, right? Because Abraham rolls out the red carpet for them overboard. As you mentioned, there's a lot of ink spent on this whole scene, right? I mean, it draws it out. And so it's this idea that hospitality, the kind of hospitality that Abraham was extending to these strangers, as you said, that he recognizes being very special, but it's still, it points to the character of Abraham. So there's definitely this kind of stepping down, as you notice there, Amber, where Abraham's here, and then Lot is also trying to be like his uncle in many respects, but maybe isn't quite as discerning, but he's still trying to extend hospitality to these visitors. And then you have the character of the men of Sodom, right? I mean, which is just awful. They're just they want to brutalize, they want to rape, they want to control. Basically, they want to domineer. It's this real comparison that certainly is going on in the text. That's a really good catch. Did you see some of that as well in your studies, Craig?
I did. Exactly what you both have already pointed out between chapters 18 and 19. Just this incredible compare and contrast, and for me, it really boils down to chapter 18 being a picture of life with God inside of righteousness with God, versus 19, which is the picture of life outside of God that Lot was dealing with in the middle of Sodom and Gomorrah in the city and all the wickedness that he was in the midst of. Specifically looking at chapter 18 a little bit more, verses 16 through 33, Abraham is what I would say arguing with God, right? He's pleading for Sodom and Gomorrah for the sake of 50, 40, 30, etc. number of righteousness, all the way down of the righteous people, all the way down to 10 people.
Yeah.
And it's this, to your point, you've already made, Ellis, this long, drawn-out conversation. But it's this point the author wants to make. God is a talkative God. Robert W. Jensen is a Lutheran theologian who made a conversation that God is a conversationalist, and he created us as human beings to have conversations with. And what's more, he demands an answer. And Abraham has no problem giving him not only answers, but questions of his own. Why do you have to destroy this city if there are some righteous people among them? And really, we start to see the template for how God will find and make the way forward, first through Israel, and then ultimately through Jesus. We see the righteous saving the unrighteous. And in this case, in Sodom and Gomorrah, that doesn't really pan out, obviously. We know what happens to destroy it in fire and brimstone. But we get the sense that the pattern is set. We know God's heart now, and he's looking for that righteous one, who he finds obviously in Jesus, and Jesus is the righteous one that saves all the rest of us unrighteous folk.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. And I really love what you pointed out about God being a conversationalist. And that maybe because Moses does the same thing. Moses has this, what could only be quantified as almost an argument with God, a back and forth. Please don't destroy the people. He even takes ownership of it. So Moses has this conversation with God. We see Abraham having this conversation with God. Elijah had the same kind of conversations with God. Jeremiah, who was half the time was just screaming at God, right? So it's always like the most spiritual and most devoted and most, intimate relationships with God center around this very raw and real conversation of just sharing what you're really thinking with God, right? And Abraham was really concerned about the people in Sodom and Gomorrah, and not the least of reason, which was that his nephew, who he loved, was there, right? So that's a real interesting piece. And maybe the point of it, we want to ask, well, does God change his mind, right? Because it seems like God keeps changing his mind. Like, okay, well, I'll do it for this many. Yeah, I'll do it for that many too, right? But maybe the real lesson is not so much that it's that God loves having this conversation. God loves this intimate conversation with you, where you share your heart with him, and he's responsive to that, right? He's responsive to that. So that's excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I see it like he's just interceding, and I think we intercede with God all the time. We might, it's like we remind him of his own character. God, you know you are good,
Right,
and
right.
I know that you love me. So I'm interceding. I'm pleading with your own character to remind you, because I need something. Like he's I don't know. I think that's how I kind of see it.
Yeah, and
I don't think it's an accident. We just the well is put together, I think, in a divinely inspired way. Even though humans have made it, but it's not an accident that we just read in Matthew 6 the model prayer that Jesus teaches us last week. Prayer is our entry into that conversation with God, and we've been taught how to enter into that conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely, we have, and so the story then, of course, plays out, and it doesn't work out the way Abraham wanted it to. So that's another aspect to it, is Abraham pleaded and pleaded, but at the end, God's will was still done there, and Lot was spared, right? Lot was spared, barely.
Sometimes I think, Abraham, if you knew Lot was there and you knew Lot was a family of 4, why didn't you just keep interceding until you got to 4? Why stop at 10?
Yeah, yeah, it may have been his whole household. We don't know, but I mean, it was this thing where he was trying to get it down as far as he could,
Yep.
wasn't he?
And in a sense, he did get it down to the household of Lot, because Lot ended up in Zoar, which is a small city, and in the original Hebrew, there's a sense of smallness in that name.
Mhm.
And Zoar being on the outskirts, or maybe what we would consider a suburb of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his family were enough to save that city.
That's right. Yeah, he spared Zoar because of Lot, and I think that's an important part of the story as well, because his family was taking refuge there. So
Do you think he was saved because of Lot or because of Abraham's prayer? Because it's whoever is associated to Abraham will be blessed,
yeah,
not
no,
necessarily
right.
because of himself.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's because of that. You see Lot really in this story. Lot comes out looking pretty good, even though, I mean, he gets to the place where he's willing to say, hey, take my daughters, and you're thinking, wait a minute, that doesn't seem like a good character thing to do. But really, what it's showing is how important this idea of hospitality was to them, how it was essential to their character, to their being. It's almost like, and he says, these men are under my roof. They've come under my care. You can't do this to them. This was very much a Hebrew, a kind of essential belief in that era, where you were good to your word, and when you took in someone, you were being hospitable to them, that they were like family. You became like family, right? It was essential in that time.
So much so, so much so he throws his daughters out in a sense of trying to protect the angels or the men of the Lord, and maybe that's in one sense a testament or a message of our own mistreatment of women throughout history. But on the flip side, he kind of gets his own medicine at the end of Genesis 19. The last few verses, his daughters play those sexual games upon their own father in the attempt to ultimately extend Lot's line. He doesn't know it, but he passively is subject to his own treatment of them.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting catch. I really appreciate that. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. At the end, these daughters had been impacted by Sodom and Gomorrah, perhaps more than he understood, and that happens in real life, doesn't it? Yeah. Where you can get them out of Sodom, but are you going to get Sodom out of them? It's the same problem with the people of Israel coming. God got them out of Egypt, but then he had to get Egypt out of them. And you see that certainly with his wife, right? Who looked back and turned a pillar of salt and all that. But it's this idea of she didn't want to leave the life she had in Sodom. And Sodom is depicted as this just horrible place. I mean, it was just complete depravity, control, brutalization, brutalization of people, dehumanization. When it's interesting that when the prophets talk about Sodom, when they talk about Sodom, and the great sin of Sodom actually was that they didn't care for the poor. They didn't care for the widow. They abused the poor, and so it's this idea of dehumanizing people, and you see that in them wanting to take these guests, and they wanted to sodomize them. We've named it after them, right? They wanted to rape these guests. It was their way of trying to control them and to show them, to dehumanize them. And that was their big problem.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amber.
Yeah. Hey, Craig, I also noticed that part about the daughters that jumped out to me as well in a little bit of a different way. I noticed that it seems interesting that right after a grand judgment and rescue of Lot, you have his own children, his daughters. So Lot is now drunk and naked, and his own children, his daughters, do this thing with him, this sexual thing, a sin. And then it reminds me that the last time I saw a grand judgment and a rescue, which I would say was the story of Noah, right after that story, the very next sentence, the very next paragraph was Noah being drunk and naked, and then one of his own children, his son, did something also sinful, probably related sexually as well, we assume. And so that stood out to me, that you have these two moments of grand judgment and rescue followed by the story of this thing happening. So my question, Ellis, would be, is this poetic literature, or is this supposed to be prophetic literature in our minds?
Yeah, no, certainly prophetic. I think it can be both, but it certainly is prophetic, and it really is the story of Scripture. When you read the book of Judges, which comes later, you really have this cycle that happens, and it's just that. It's what did you say? What was the pattern? You said judgment, rescue.
Yeah, you have rescue and judgment followed by immediately this big sin thing.
Rescue, judgment, sin. Mm-hmm. And you see that throughout Israel's history, and the Judges is a good place to look. It's this cycle of they're doing okay, then they go really bad, and then God rescues them, He judges them, and then they go back to sinning, and it's this cycle again. God's continuously rescuing them. This is when He would rise up a judge to rescue them, but then they would go right back. Then they would get saved, and they were like happy, yes, God saved us, glory to God, and they're good for a little while, and then boom, they fall right off, and they're sinning again against God. So it's the biblical pattern that you're seeing there. Certainly, you see it in Noah. You see it again here in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah,
and then we see it in ourselves, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
The ultimate salvation rescue plan through Jesus.
Right. Brings us to the New Testament, right? And we're in Matthew chapter 7. Didn't know if there was anything else from I don't want to pass up anything that you got from the Noah story that you'd like to throw in. Anything else, Craig or Amber, either one?
Yeah, before we jump into the New Testament, I had one thing from chapter 20, because we talk so much about chapter 19. Mm-hmm. Chapter 20, because I'm crazy about the trees. You have Abraham leaving the oaks of Mamre and leaving again, and he's leaving the promised land. Again, and then you get the whole him and Sarah lie that he's his sister again. You have that whole story all over again repeated. I guess the only question I had was really, it's funny because the first time they left the promised land, it says specifically there's a famine. This one doesn't give us any reason. So I'm wondering, do you have any insights? Because I couldn't find, why is he leaving the promised land again here?
Yeah. It was still a semi-nomadic lifestyle. Abraham is not and I'm putting it in pretty simplistic terms, but he's not a farmer yet. He's still very much a what was considered animal husbandry, cattle and stuff. And you were always having to look for places to graze and good grazing lands, and water was super important in those days. All those kinds of things. So even though we're not told, it is a part of the natural semi-nomadic lifestyle that Abraham and his family are leading at this time, where he'll plant for a while somewhere, and he has these particular spots where he stops, but then he moves on. And so it's probably just a natural flow of that going to Egypt. Egypt was the place to make a long story short, Egypt was the one place in the ancient Mediterranean world where they never had famines, or just practically unheard of, because of the Nile River. And it was a constant source of water. It never stopped. They never didn't have enough water. And so this is why when Moses turned the Nile to blood, such a big deal, such a big deal. It was considered the breadbasket of the ancient world. There was always wheat, always product in Egypt. So people would turn to Egypt in these times. And so there's no doubt that that's probably part of the reason that drives them there. Yeah.
Except,
Yeah. Okay, so great. So Matthew chapter 7, we have really the culmination of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is probably his longest sermon or his longest discourse, and it's really a great chapter. And it starts with chapter 7, verse 1. It talks about this word about judgment. Did you guys get anything from that?
Yeah, it jumps right in, doesn't it? It's kind of hard to get past just the brevity and the straightforward simplicity of judge not lest you be judged. What do we do with that in the life of Jesus we've been called to live, and in the life of the church? But then following, in 2:7-2-5, there's almost some qualifications that Jesus puts on us, as in the sense of, well, maybe I know you're going to judge some, or maybe discerns. This is how you do it in a responsible way with some guardrails and boundaries. Here's how you approach such a thing that's very dangerous. I told you not to do it, but if you're going to do it, here's some guardrails that you need to keep in mind. And all that keeps them playing back to me. Ultimately, I can take these things to extreme, because if you can't ever judge, what do you do with people like Hitler? I mean, there's obviously extremely evil things and people that happen in the world that you have to do something about, or at least our human nature thinks we should do something about. And so, Bonhoeffer has always been a guide to me, because he had an opinion about what should be done with Hitler, but he also wrote at great length and very eloquently about the cost of and the life of discipleship. So really just first curious about your thoughts, Ellis, on this sense of we don't judge, but we're also called to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, and discerning out in the world, especially the church itself. So how do we reconcile those two sides of the coin?
Yeah, no, that's excellent. We're also told to have nothing to do with evil, to resist the devil, and he will flee. Those kinds of things, and obviously those kinds of things require a certain amount of judgment, right? So I think there is a fine line and important distinction between judging and discernment. And you use the word discern, Craig, several times. A natural word to use when you're talking about these things is that we are called to discern between good and evil. We're called to discern people's actions and to be really careful about that. In fact, here at the end of the sermon, these scenes with Jesus, narrow road, wide road, he goes on to talk about false prophets and all this, and then that horrible line about, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven. Most of us hate that line, right? Scary stuff. Well, these are warnings, and so he's warning us, in a sense, to your point. It's almost like he's warning us about what happens when we don't judge, right? We might end up on the wrong road. We might end up with the wrong people. We might end up with the wrong. Really, what he's talking about is the heart, right? Your heart. So I think he calls us to discern. Yes, do not judge, lest ye be judged, is really coming off of this chapter where he's been talking, if you remember, about the spiritual gifts, the spiritual actions of almsgiving and prayer and fasting, and not doing it out in public where everybody can see it. He's dealing a lot with pride, the things you chase after. Do you have all the designer labels, and you have the designer house, and you have the designer car, all the he's talking about what are the things you're chasing after, and it's a heart disease. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be. That's all in chapter 6. So he's really talking, I think, about the things that we chase after. He's talking about the condition of our heart, where our heart belongs. And so when he talks about judging, it really is in the context of that. The way we judge each other, who's spiritual, who's not spiritual, and judging our eternal salvation. I don't think it's ever my place, ever, to judge someone, the state of someone's spiritual life, or where they're headed, whether they're going to heaven or not. That's not for me to judge. It's just not my job. And God says it's not my job because I wouldn't be very good at it, right? It's his job. But that doesn't mean that we're not to judge between good and evil and what's right and wrong. We do that on a daily basis. Is that kind of where you thought about it, Amber, or what did you get out of that there?
Yeah. I actually wrote down the same question when I first read it. I was like, so are we never to give verbal rebuke ever? Like, that's exactly the very first question I asked when I read the same thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I think where my mind went was, I don't think this is never give verbal rebuke. I think it is just be careful of giving rebuke, specifically when you don't even look at yourself. Who are you to give rebuke or to judge someone when you have this giant log in your own eye? I think those two lines are kind of meant to go together. It's not just all the things you said, yes, in plus, was look internally first. I think we are told elsewhere, Jesus tells us that to really love someone is not to let them live in their sin or let them live in their flesh. And so we are told to maybe verbally rebuke them, in the sense that I'm lovingly telling them, hey, this is flesh, you're living in your flesh here, even though it may feel like judgment, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
not judging, like you said, their eternal salvation or their intentions. It just, hey, I'm noticing this thing. I think that's loving.
Yeah.
But I think what here we're also being just cautious of, when you do start to verbal rebuke people, you need to pay attention to yourself as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. I always go back to like how I deal with my kids, my family. It's like you love them, and if my child is going to run out into the street, I'm going to rebuke him. I'm going to go out there and grab him and say, don't do that, right? Because I know it's hurting him, and that's out of love. And I think completely has to do with that. Where I don't think it's my job to go up to some stranger that I've never met before and tell them how awful they are, or how they're doing this wrong, or this, or they're, sinning, or what have you. I don't even know them. It has to be out of love. This is part of the problem I have with Facebook and us kind of doing this on Facebook with people that we really don't know. They don't know that I love them. So how are they going to take my telling them they're wrong about this, or my judging them in some way? I think this is when people get defensive. But what tends to happen in our culture, seems to be happening, is that no one wants to, quote unquote, judge anyone, right? No one wants to say anything that they're afraid of offending, right? Any little thing we say is we're going to offend someone. And what happens is that people can keep sailing along, to your point, Amber. They can keep sailing along in their sin, and it's destructive. It's destroying their lives, and no one will tell them anything. So I mean, what kind of love is that, where no one is saying anything and they don't see it, right? And so I would agree with that. uh,
I I wasn't planning on saying this. This is slightly personal, but I think this attitude of our culture nowadays, of anything you say about anyone could be said as judgment. So don't judge. If you're a Christian, it says don't to judge. So I think what's happened in our society and our culture today is, so we are afraid to say anything like sorry, it's personal, so I'm trying to figure out how I want to say it. I think what we get stuck to do is silence is now kindness. And what that has done in my own life, just a little personal story, is I'm a rare mom. My daughter has a rare medical condition. And what's happened is, because these loving, sweet mamas don't want to feel like they're being judgmental towards, or their children being judgmental to my child, when their children sees something different and they ask, hey, mom, why is that girl's leg look the way it does? It's loving for them to actually embrace it and say, hey, look, let's ask about that leg, or let's see. But what happens is, in our society, everyone has hush hush, and what happens is, now they're felt like there's this prejudice put upon my child. It's not intentional. I just think our society has gone so overboard with this judgmental thing, rather than just being loving to be curious about other people. It has gone so overboard, where it's personally affected our family, where it's gone too far.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. That I know that is so personal for you, I know, and it's so true. It's so right on, because we it's like when you are trying to help someone, maybe, in having to say something that's not easy to hear, it makes people uncomfortable. It makes the person uncomfortable. Maybe even makes them feel some pain. And we've gotten to this place in our society where any kind of pain is wrong and awful and bad, and that's just not the case. In fact, I've learned more from my pain than I have from my joy. I've learned more from my failures and my mistakes than I have from my successes.
Oh, yeah.
We always do. But we have maybe a whole generation now that where we have so protected them, because we don't want them to experience any pain. We don't want them to experience any uncomfortable feelings. We don't want them to experience any potential, even bad, like they're being left out, or they're being. And when all of those feelings, being able to experience them and work through them and push through them is a part of maturation. It's a part of growing up, right? And we may have a whole generation that struggles with that now because they were told that they didn't have to feel bad ever. They didn't have to feel pain ever, right? And that's been detrimental. This last leg of Jesus's sermon, as he's coming to the end, is a study on how life is painful, and our decisions carry consequences that can be painful, right? He warns us of this. The narrow road, the wide road. That always scared me. Always worried I'm not on the narrow road. I'm on the wide road. Um, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven. There are false prophets. And I think he's speaking there to the heart, right? I mean, is that what you guys got from it with the not everyone who says to me? Because I always read that when I was younger going, oh my gosh, I hope my luck, that's me, right? I'm the one that's not really, Jesus never knew, right?
Yeah, Bonhoeffer speaks of this and talking about discipleship. His book, Cost of Discipleship, is just brilliant. If you haven't read it, I know we have here probably, but our viewers, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Mm-hmm. But one quote from him really brought Jesus being the narrow way and the gate that we travel, of course, in life with the church. But he picks up on this theme: to believe in Jesus' promise that those who follow shall possess the earth, but to encounter the enemy unarmed, to prefer suffering and justice to doing ill, that is the narrow road. To perceive other people as being weak and wrong, but still never to judge them, to proclaim the good news to them, but never to throw pearls before swine, that is the narrow road, and it is an unbearable road. I think for him, and what we've picked up on here in our theme, is it's about seeing the humanity in the other and coming to them and ministering to them in their pain and their weakness, even though we're in our own pain and weakness, and then we're helping each other in community to move forward and to grow as human beings and into the human beings that God has created us to be and he wants us to be.
Yeah. And reading Bonhoeffer is almost as much knowing about what his context, right?
Right.
Being in Nazi Germany, being a dissenter, eventually losing his life because he went against Hitler. It makes his words all that much more amazing and powerful when he talks about it. And it boils down to loving God and loving the other, right? Even the ones who are not like you, to loving them. Yeah, good. Well, we're out of time, so just Amber, you had something else? Go ahead, go for it.
I was just going to answer your question straight up. It's super fast.
Yeah, go ahead.
The whole "I never knew you." Yeah, you asked if it was a heart thing. I agree. First of all, that verse has always been like, oh, that's a scary verse. But I think you're right, Ellis. I think it's a heart thing, because I think to know Jesus, because even the demons, even the devil knows Jesus. They know who he is. They know God. So not knowing him is not enough. You have to know him. You have to accept him, and you have to actually turn. And it's the turning of your heart. It's the transition of that moving from your heart. That is what it takes for him to know you.
Good. Yeah, absolutely. Where Jesus says, "You love me, obey my commands." This is how that love is manifested. Well, hey guys, thanks. There was so much in Genesis, the Genesis chapters we went over. There's so much here in Matthew chapter 7. I hope you guys out there will just really get so much this week from these chapters. There's a lot packed in there. Try to focus in on one or two things that God gives you each day. You don't have to necessarily think about all of it, because it's a lot, but try to focus in on those one or two things, asking God to speak to you and to give you the things he wants you to know for that day that are just for you. And I pray that God blesses you this week as you study him together. And I pray that God blesses you as you worship him and obey him. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.
Have a good week.
All right.